Hey, spiritual streamers, this is Dr. Lloyd-Moffett, and I'm here in my office, and I want to give an introduction to the Eastern Orthodox form of mysticism. And it starts off with a tension that is inherent in every theistic tradition, and certainly within Christianity. On the one hand, we recognize that the creator of this whole universe is beyond any ability to fully comprehend. I mean, think about it. If you tried to read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, I couldn't get through past the introduction, but in the introduction, it says there's 100 billion galaxies, each with a billion stars. I mean, the universe is massive. How can our brain comprehend that size? We have a hard enough time just comprehending California, let alone 100 billion galaxies, each with a billion stars. And this universe is billions of years old. I mean, I have a hard time remembering what happened a few weeks ago, let alone a few years ago, let alone billions of years. And for theistic traditions, God has guided that world for all those billions of years. And if you think about just the human body, there's something like 100 million cells, each with nucleuses, each with genomes attached to it, and something like a billion cells or billion marks in each of those genomes. I don't know, science gets tricky. But if you think God designed that, guides that for every one of the 7 billion parts on our planet, I mean, it's unfathomable how great, big God is. And certainly the mysteriousness of God has to enter into my mind because God is beyond any ability for me to fully comprehend. But on the other hand, God gave us reason. And certainly God is not irrational. And so when I use my reason to try to understand God, I am legitimately approaching God through the use of reason. And so here's the tension. On the one hand, we have a belief that God is fundamentally beyond our ability to comprehend. And on the other hand, we have God as rational, and our use of reason is a legitimate path to approach God. That's the tension that is in a lot of theistic traditions, and certainly within Christianity. The Eastern Orthodox Church has tended to stress the mysteriousness of God over the clarity of God. It is come to say time and time again that we should be reminded of the limitedness by which humans can comprehend God. God must remain a mystery beyond human ability to circumscribe or understand. We talked a lot about this in the section on apophatic theology, but let me quickly remind ourselves of this. The idea here is that an infinite God cannot be grasped by a finite mind. Human language and reason can point to God, but can never encapsulate God. So listen to the 4th century mystic Gregor of Nyssa. That which is without quality cannot be measured. The invisible cannot be examined. The incorporeal cannot be weighed. The limitless cannot be compared. The incomprehensible does not admit more or less. So if we really want to say that God is unlimited, immaterial, invisible, then we really have to mean it. We have to realize that God is beyond all human conceptions. And this is what the Trinity, in part, is trying to remind us to. This is what a saint by the name of St. Maximus the Confessor wrote. That the blessed and holy divinity finds itself in essence beyond the utterable and unknowable and exceeds infinitely all infinity. It left absolutely no trace whatsoever to be comprehended by those who were together with it, nor did it allow any being to grasp how and in what manner it is at the same time unity and Trinity. For it does not belong to the nature of the created or belong to the nature of the created order to contain the created, nor can the infinite be embraced by finite beings. And thus, human reason and human language, the things we use to conceptualize God, is inevitably inexact and ultimately limiting. Language, reason necessarily falter when describing God. And remember, this is the motivation for negating or apophatic theology. As we read before of St. John Damascus, God then is infinite and incomprehensible, and all that is comprehensible about him is his infinity and his incomprehensibility. All that we can say cataphatically, positively, concerning God does not show forth his nature, but things related to his nature. And so if you recall that move in negating theology, say, posit something about God. God is just, God is Father, God is love. But then negate it, because all those concepts are only grounded on things that we can comprehend and relate to other humans. And so it is best to travel this path of understanding where we search out for the positive and then negate it to remind ourselves that's not. Now, we said this is very different from Western approaches, which really double down on reason as a pathway to God. In fact, we can prove God with reason. Reason is the way to understand God. For Orthodoxy, says no. Remind yourself continually that God is beyond all positive affirmations. We see this in Dionysius the Areopagite, where we read that long definition of God that ends with these immortal words: absolutely nothing can be asserted of it, absolutely nothing can be denied. That when we formulate affirmations or negations applying to realities that are inferior to it, we're not affirming or denying anything about the cause itself, because all affirmation remains on this side of transcendence, of him who is divested of everything and stands beyond everything. What is saying then? Any attempt to use human language and reason ultimately is grounded in human language and reason, and thus falls short as a tool to encapsulate God. And so we must negate whatever we say in doing so. And this culminates, again, as a reminder, with the great statement of Gregory Palamas: if God is, then I am not. If I am, then God is not. In other words, if you're going to use the verb to exist for God, don't use it for me, because God does not exist in the same way I exist. Now, remember, this statement is a statement of epistemology and not metaphysics. That is, it's not saying that God is the unknowable, the unknown, but rather what it's saying is humans cannot grasp fully who God is, because God is beyond all comprehension. That's negating theology. I want to then move on from that, because Eastern Orthodoxy makes a very interesting play mystically on this. So, as a little background, we have to understand how the Roman and Greek world saw things. They saw that the world was divided into two realms. The higher realm, the realm of ideas or forms, are perfect. That is, we have an image of a perfect cat. But then our realm is filled with imperfect varieties of that perfection, so that our cats are all imperfect forms of the ideal cat. And comprehension comes by connecting the lower realm with the upper realm. The reason why I know this is a table is because somewhere there is a perfect form of table, a perfect example of a table, and I know that this conforms into it in some odd way. And so, historically speaking, when we had when we approach this world of forms, historically speaking, that was seen as a journey into clarity. We move from the messiness of this world to the purity and clarity of the world above. Now, this basic notion of unchanging, pure ideal in the world above and messy down here really influenced Western theology, because Western theology began to see that at the end of the spiritual journey was the beatific vision, where you saw the world clearly for the first time. And so you're journeying from darkness to light and perfection, from imperfectness to seeing God who is perfect and unchanging. However, Eastern Orthodoxy rejected that path. Instead, They said that as you go on your spiritual journey up the hill, what you come to see is not more and more clarity, not this imperfect, unchanging image, but you're actually journeying into darkness. You come to comprehend that there's so much more to the world than we could ever fully grasp on our own. And so this ladder of divine ascent is not one that is leading from darkness to clarity, but from the messiness of this world into a darkness, into a cloud of realizing how little you actually know about the divine. And so it's a journey in which at each step you don't have a more perfect view of God, but you have an expanded view of God and the realization how little you know of God. So listen to Gregory of Nyssa here. For leaving behind everything that is observed, not only what the sense comprehends, but also what the intelligence thinks it sees, it keeps penetrating deeper until by the soul's yearning for understanding it gains access to the invisible and incomprehensible, and there it sees God. This is the true knowledge of that which is sought. This is the seeing that consists in not seeing, because that which is sought transcends all knowledge, being separate on all sides by incomprehensibility, as by a kind of darkness. Now, this flipped traditional Greek thought on its head. When you approach God in the perfect form, you don't have a beatific vision where you have perfect clarity, but you realize how limited your view was before, how much vaster God is, how much more expansive than you could even imagine to comprehend beforehand. And so it's a journey not into darkness, or not into light and clarity, but into darkness and unknowability. And the analogy that Gregory uses is Moses, the one human who's seen God, right? He goes up Mount Sinai not in a perfectly clear day, but rather in a dense cloud. And so what you begin to notice then is that Moses approaches God and found a mysterious darkness. And so we, as we mature, will also find that darkness. And so the greatest theology has to be apophatic, or really using paradoxes. It's the seeing that consists in not seeing, the sober inebriation, a watchful sleep, a passionless passion, a dazzling darkness, a thunderous silence. In other words, when language fails fundamentally to be able to capture the reality of encountering God, we then use language to capture that incomprehensibility through paradox. As Dionysius the Areopagite says, God is known both in all objects and outside all objects. He is nothing of what is, and therefore cannot be through anything that is, and yet he is in all in all. He is in nothing and anything, and yet he is known by all in all. All the same time, he is not known by anything in anything. So what do we see here? The highest form of spiritual progress is an ascent into the mysteriousness of God. We unify with God not in a perfect lens of insight, but rather it's the human quest to realize how little we know. Listen to Gregory of Nyssa again. Then at last she gives up all she has found, for she realized that what she seeks cannot be understood only in the very inability to comprehend his essence, that every intelligible attribute becomes merely a hindrance to those who seek to find him. I abandoned all creatures and passed by all that is intelligible in creation. And when I gave up every finite mode of comprehension, there it was I found my beloved by faith. From this vantage, deeper than the dark cloud of mysticism, a new vision is perceived to unite to the soul. Listen to what Gregory says again here. To one who sees the Creator, the whole of creation is limited. But one glimpse of God's light makes everything that has been created seem too narrow. The light of interior contemplation, in fact, enlarges the dimensions of the soul, which by dint of expanding in God transcends the world. Should I say this? The soul of the contemplative transcends itself. When in God's light, it is transported beyond itself. Then looking below itself, it understands how limited it is that which on earth seemed to have no limits. So what does it mean? As you mature in faith, you come to realize the utter incomprehensibility of God, that God is not just sort of just beyond my senses, but is way beyond any human conception. And thus the path to God is one that is infinite into that darkness. Listen to Gregory again. Oh no, this is from Origen, a 3rd century saint, really becomes foundational to Christian theology. But he says, those who devote themselves to the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge have no end to their labors. How could there be an end, a limit, where the wisdom of God is concerned? The nearer someone comes to wisdom, the deeper he is able to, the deeper he finds it to be. The more he probes into the depths, the more he sees he will never be able to understand it or express it in words. Travelers then on the road to God's wisdom find that the further they go, the more the road opens up until it stretches into infinity. And so what does Origen say? He's saying that if you meet somebody who's like, I got God, this totally makes sense, I have a clear vision of where we're going, I'm confident, well, Origen says you lack spiritual maturity. Because spiritual maturity is the realization of how limited your knowledge is of God, how much greater God is than any set of human constructions. And so what this should breed in spiritual progress is great humility, because you realize that you don't have the answers. In fact, you realize how far humans are from really comprehending that God. Listen to Gregory of Nyssa again. The Apostle Paul teaches, I think, that in our constant participation in the blessed nature of the good, the graces that we receive at every point are indeed great, but the path that lies beyond our immediate grasp is infinite. This will constantly happen to those who share in the divine goodness, and they will always enjoy a greater and greater experience in grace throughout all eternity. Continues the next page. Thus they never stop rising, moving from one new beginning to the next, by an ever greater and greater desire, the soul rising constantly to one another, to another which lies ahead, and thus it makes its way through ever higher regions into transcendence. And so what is he saying here? He is saying that it's not a movement where you finally reach an end and you see God in clarity, just gaze upon the beatific vision. That's pretty much what Augustine imagined in the West. But no, quite the contrary. We're going to turn the ancient model on its head. What we're going to see here in Eastern Orthodox mysticism is perfection is choosing never to stop evolving, never to think that I've reached the edge and now I get God. Perfection is the constant movement into God in which you realize more and more how limited your view of God was in the past. And this really inverts the Platonist view, in which you go from dwelling in messiness and then finally see the perfect form. Instead, you're always ever evolving, trying to make sense of the Creator, which always is going to lie beyond all human comprehension. So, if we see the ancient model, what was good was immutability, not changing, finally seeing the world as it is. And for Eastern Orthodoxy, the good is never ceasing to change. To participate in divine nature is not to sit quietly, but to journey into God and journey out of oneself. And if you're on this journey, what you are doing is slowly realizing how limited you are. Sin, then, is a refusal to grow. And the more you grow, the more humble you are. It's about continual transformation, always on the way up. It is always a journey in which you never arrive. It's a continual ascent. Heaven is not a place you go, but an orientation. So heaven is then the process of approaching God continually, realizing that in the process you will never reach that destination, but rather realize how limited your previous understanding is. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, this journey is something that happens within, something that happens through meditation and contemplation. There was once a very famous monk who traveled on a pilgrimage to Rome from Egypt. He was told of a celebrated recluse, a woman who had lived in a small room for 40 years, never leaving. Skeptical, for the monk had always tried to go travel to holy places. The monk came to her and said, "Why are you sitting here? Like, why are you just sitting? How can you be holy if you never see or talk to holy things and holy people?" And she says, what do you mean? I'm on a journey. I'm not sitting. And that is, the journey as you approach God is not checking off a bucket list of spiritual experiences, but is a maturity that happens from within. A woman leaving her cell may be more spiritually mature than somebody who has been to every monastery or every holy site in the world. And in Orthodoxy, they call this journey the process of deification. That is to slowly become more and more identified with the divine. One of the great saints, St. Athanasius, says, God became human so that humans might become divine. Maximus the Confessor said, in deification we are called by grace to become everything God is by nature. And indeed, this process is biblical. In 2 Peter 1:4, he says, he has given us through these things his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may escape the corruption of the world because of lust, and may become participants in the divine nature. And so what is this here? The process of salvation, the process of spiritual growth is a process where you slowly lose more and more of your human identity and embrace more and more of the divine identity. And that is not a process in which will ever stop. It is a slow replacement theology where you lose yourself into the very nature of God. We participate in the divine nature. Now, we should be clear that for Eastern Orthodoxy, you do not become God. You don't invite in the essence of God. But the language that is used is one of God's essence versus God's energy. So God's essence is who God is in and of itself. But God's energy is the way that God expresses itself in the world. Listen to Vladimir Lossky here. The energies, like the persons, are not elements of the divine being, which can be conceived of apart in separation from the Trinity, which their common manifestation, the external splendor. In other words, it is God's emanations out from it. And so we can become fully ablaze with the energies of God. Gregory Palamas writes, the divine nature must be said to be at the same time both exclusive of and in some sense open to participation. We attain to participation in the divine nature, and yet at the same time remains totally inaccessible. We need to affirm both at the same time to preserve the antinomy as a criterion of right devotion. What do they say? As you grow spiritually, you embrace more and more the divine energy that is flowing from the Creator, and it slowly begins to illumine and set ablaze your human nature. This is the goal, to become more and more divine. And this is what you saw at Adam and Eve before the fall. They were so tied into the energies of God that they were deified. They were immortal beings, constantly vivified by the energies of God. And what happened in the tree of eating of the tree of knowledge was the loss of that close connection to the divine energies. And when we lost that connection to the divine energies, we in turn became mortal beings who would fight our mortality. And so the journey for humans now is an unending journey from mortality to immortality, from ignorance to knowledge of the incomprehensibility of God, from confidence in our knowledge to humility before a greater knowledge. And the goal is a slow evolution towards deification, in which we become more fully divine as we mature spiritually. This is a never-ending process. So listen to Greg of Nyssa again. For the reason we also say that the great Moses, as he was becoming ever greater, at no time stopped in his ascent, nor did he set a limit for himself in his upward course. Once having set foot on the ladder which God set up, as Jacob says, he continually climbed the step above and never ceased to rise higher, because he always found one step higher than the one he obtained. And the model for this is the Transfiguration. If you know your biblical story, Jesus, while he was a human, appeared in his divine form for a few of his disciples. And this is usually depicted in a mandala blue-shaped iconographically in Christianity, because it is not that it was visible, his divine form. It's not like he glowed, but he became totally transformed by the divine energies. We see this in the story of the Transfiguration, which here I think is from Mark. And so later theologians call that sort of an embrace of the light. Now, this is somewhat contradictory metaphors from the darkness before, but it is a light of incomprehensibility. That is, when you have the light, you do not actually have it. This is in the New Theologian. For you have it since you see it, but you cannot hold it or grasp it. You imagine that you possess it, but as you close your eyes, the light becomes impossibly held, and you again have nothing. So what's Simeon saying here? Another way to imagine this path into darkness is to imagine it as an uncreated light that embraces you more and more fully, so much so that it blinds you. And so notice how the imagery of light and the imagery of darkness is the same. In neither case is it absolute clarity. No, rather it is either a blinding, uncreated light, or it is a darkness that goes through. Let's look at this again. God appears in a light which is personal and substantial, in a shape without shape, form without form. He is seen invisibly and incomprehensible, and comprehended incomprehensibility. But this light beckons us. It dispassion, the form of lightning, united itself with me, and evermore remains. Understand this spiritually, you read, lest you wretched defiled, and produce in me in the ineffable sweetness of consummation, infinite longing for marriage and union with God, sharing in which I, even I, have become depassionate, who was inflamed by passion, of fire with longing for it. I particular light, yea, I became light, beyond every passion and beyond every will. And so the goal here is to become unified with God in this incomprehensible light, which is actually the same as darkness in both instances, to be ever more and more become by grace all things God is by nature. That is the theology behind the Eastern Orthodox mysticism, that we shed our human nature, embrace a divine nature, so that our human nature is replaced by the divine nature by the grace of God, and we move ever and ever towards our destination, never arriving, always becoming more humble, and always recognizing that it is the continual journey, that refusal to stop maturing in your faith, that is salvation itself. That's the Eastern Orthodox view of mysticism.